Good evening, councillors. Good evening, public gallery, madam. First item is minutes of the last meeting. Any comments? I sign them as accurate. Thank you very much.
Agreed.
Apologies for absence. Fiona?
Had apologies from Councillor Palmer.
Thank you very much. Declaration of interest. Fiona?
None received prior to the meeting, Leader.
Thank you very much. Councillors, anything to declare at the meeting? Thank you very much. We will move on. We have one question from a member of the public, from Cathy Smythe, which she has asked the portfolio holder to read out a summary of before he gives his response. So, Councillor Macleod.
Thank you, Leader. The question is, can Waverley Borough Council please identify and make available and or publish the appropriate assessment or assessments in which they currently rely for the purpose of taking planning decisions for sites within the Waverley area which are considered to have an effect on the Thames Basin Heath Spa and the Weldon Heath Phases 1 and 2 spas. Response is, the Council prepares an appropriate assessment in consultation with Natural England when a proposed project is considered likely to have a significant effect on a special protection area. Any such appropriate assessment, together with Natural England's consultation response, are made publicly available via the Council's website. The Council also relies on the adopted Local Plan Part 1 Habitats Regulations Assessment and the addendum to that assessment, which contain appropriate assessments relating to both the Thames Basin Heaths and the Weldon Heath Special Protection Areas. These assessments were prepared by a specialist, independent technical consultants acting in consultation with Natural England. The Council's strategy to avoid harm to the special protection areas was found to be sound by the local plan inspector and now forms part of its development plan. A copy of the assessments and the inspector's findings on this issue, as set out in his examination report, are also publicly available. The background documents referred to in this response can be found on the Council's website. There is a link provided, which I won't attempt to read through because it's too complicated to read it, but it will be on the published response. There's a link available. Thank you, Leader.
Thank you very much, Councillor Macleod. I believe that is the only question we have from members of the public. Any questions from members?
None, Chairman.
Thank you very much. The next comment is leaders and portfolio holders updates. Short of wishing you all a very happy new year, I have no particular update. Does any portfolio holder wish to comment? Thank you very much. We will then move to item 7, which is a budget update for the year. The portfolio holder is Councillor Merryweather, who I believe is dying to introduce this item.
Thank you, Leader. This is really an update report. I don't intend here to go into too much details of the budgets, where they are or where they might end up. And I'm particularly going to focus on the general fund budget because that is the one which is our day-to-day operating budget outside of our social housing function. It's our pot. It's where our retained business rates, our share of council taxes, our fees and charges, and our grants come into, and it's the pot that we spend out on services from. It is excluding sort of the ups and the downs, it's only about 1% of our total reserves, but it is the only reserve that we're allowed to use for these sort of operating purposes. It is not a reserve that has a huge value brought forward. We don't have capacity to run a deficit, so I will say at the outset that we are planning a balanced budget. Our budget is almost a sort of an annual fight between increasing costs and diminishing revenues. It's no surprise, or it should be no surprise to anybody at this stage, that our costs are increasing much, much faster than our ability to generate revenues. For the last few years, since 2017, it's been known that these years will be tough, and this year is certainly coming up to those expectations. We started during the year looking at a possible shortfall in our revenues of about 1.4 million, and in actual fact it looks as though it's going to be closer to 1.8 million. The team have been working incredibly hard to look for savings, general cost savings across the board, and have been tremendously successful, meaning that we should be able to balance the budget with increases in council tax and fees and charges, which broadly are in line with RPI inflation. We are suffering at the moment because the government either sets or heavily regulates the income that we can raise. We have absolutely no say, for example, in business rates, and 95% of what is collected from the businesses in our borough does not end up here. It ends up either in Surrey or in central government. Our grant income is diminishing fast, as the medium-term financial strategy has highlighted, and our ability to raise additional funds through fees and charges is regulated as well. We are now in the final stages of preparing the budget. We have the final numbers to crunch. It will be released to the Oversight and Scrutiny Committee, I think, on Friday. So I'd just like to recommend now to the Executive that we continue our work with officers to identify options to balance the budget, and ask the Joint Overview and Scrutiny Committee to consider the detailed budget proposals at their January meeting, and to make any suggestions to the Executive to prioritise options to balance the budget.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Hyman, I have you down to speak on this item. Do you wish to speak?
Yes, thanks. Very quickly. I'm just slightly surprised that, though we've had relatively good news from the government, that RSG isn't coming in, and it says, I think, in paragraph 4.3 that we're effectively safe until 22-23, at least from that. And, you know, the threats that have been held over us for a number of years obviously haven't come true as yet, and we shouldn't necessarily assume that they will come true. Are we still continuing on the assumption that we have got to expect a revenue support grant, a negative RSG in the future? And what's the level of certainty on that? Because I think members ought to know before we go into the value for money overview and scrutiny meeting in a fortnight's time, you know, exactly what the situation is. We're also told, I think it's paragraph 4.5, what the Executive does have plans for new homes bonus or investment and the medium-term financial plan. I'd just like your assurance that we're going to know that before we go into the value for money O&S. Obviously, it's necessary information before then, and I'm not sure why we don't have that here today. So it'd be nice if you can just assure us or tell us what those plans are. The other thing is, of course, that we always have to be concerned that we're driving inflation through our approach at the council by putting prices up and putting rents and particularly council tax up every year. And the residents always say, always seem to say, cut out the waste, cut out the excess, cut out the inefficiencies first before you charge us more money. And we want to be absolutely sure that that is what we've done, and we need to be able to show the residents that we have done that, or that we are doing that, and rather than simply putting up the charges to all our residents. On the HRA at 4.9, it's I think it would be good if the council would recognise that there is an automatic real terms weekly rent increase of 2% happening on April the 1st this year, because the past year has been a 53-week year, effectively giving people a 2% discount, just paying 2% less, but for one more week. So can you tell us what the government guidelines are, please, where it says at 4.9 that there are government guidelines? If we add 2% to those, what does the reality mean for our residents? So, yeah, just a couple of things there that I've picked up. Thank you.
Any other councillor wish to comment? Councillor Merryweather.
Thank you, Leader. Thank you, Councillor Hyman. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 points. Right. On the current year budget will be set on the conditions that prevail today, that were disclosed to us, revealed to us very recently. Future years may be impacted by some of the things that you mentioned, but this year's budget will be based on the funding structure as it prevails today. It is a funding environment where our residents, our businesses, our visitors, excluding our council house tenants, pay us, I think, probably about £170 million a year. And we get to keep 10 million of that to fund all of the services that we are expected to pay. Our residents, I think sometimes, perhaps understandably, are left with the impression that everything that they pay on the back of a council tax bill with our name on it, or a business rates bill with our name on it, ends up somehow in our pockets, and it doesn't, and we're getting to keep less and less of it. And if we do go into negative tariff, our council taxpayers will be subsidising central government through the back door, because the government will be collecting more from us than we collect from our businesses in retained business rates. So it is an environment where we are having to cut our cloth to match the demands and that are being made on us. I can reassure him on New Homes Bonus that New Homes Bonus will be retained for capital projects. It will not go into net services as he asked. In terms of what residents say, well, we have just had a consultation with residents, and yes, residents do want us to make efficiencies, and the current budget has quite a substantial efficiency. The largest single number is a 5% saving efficiency over the prior year, which I think is worth some congratulation. But even that 5% saving is not enough to cover the reduction in external funding that we're allowed to keep by central government, or some of the other pressures that we are facing. All of those things will be addressed in detail in the budget when it's presented to the Oversight and Security Scrutiny Committee.
Thank you. Any other comments from councillors? Then there's no formal recommendation. I trust we are agreed to note that item. Thank you very much. We'll now move on to item 8. Must take my glasses off. Item 8, which is budget management, request for supplementary estimate for Farnham Neighbourhood Plan Review. And that is also in the competent hands of Councillor Merryweather.
Thank you again, Leader. Right, so as we know, there will be a review of the Farnham Neighbourhood Plan, which will involve all sorts of things, including the referendum. We are not reimbursed by central government for all of our costs in that regard. In actual fact, there will be a shortfall. We estimated it to be about £51,000, which we propose will be funded from available funds in the Revenue Reserve Fund. So the recommendation is that the Executive approves a supplementary estimate for £51,000 to cover the costs of the Farnham Neighbourhood Review Plan.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Hyman, you are down to speak on this item again. Do you wish to speak?
Well, I didn't, Chairman, but actually following the public question, which I was unaware of, which is quite interesting, the response that was given there does have some relevance to this neighbourhood plan issue. And the question really is, should we be doing this? Are we looking at doing it twice, doing everything over and over again? Or perhaps you could say for a third time. The response that was given to Cathy Smythe's question in respect of habitats, I have some difficulty with that. Obviously, logically, seeing as LPP1, we're saying that we've got an appropriate assessment at LPP1, which we haven't, because that was done at a time prior to people over Wind Sweetman, when the council's position was we didn't need an appropriate assessment. There certainly isn't an assessment with the bird numbers in, or any evidence that the mitigation is effective, which is what Pete Sweetman requires. So not happy with that answer, and unless we're going to get some accurate answers to questions, and the public can certainly expect to have more accurate answers.
Councillor Harman, you don't seem to be talking to the supplementary effort for the Farnham Neighbourhood Plan Review.
Well, no, obviously the point with the Neighbourhood Plan Review, Leader, is that it is assuming that the council has an appropriate assessment and that this money isn't going to be wasted. So what we're saying is, unless we have an appropriate assessment, then there's a very good chance that this is going to be wasted. And I think you need to get the priorities straight on this and make sure that we've got the information to residents straight and set the record straight, as was agreed at the last council meeting, before we move forward spending more money, making another mistake. Thank you.
Right, thank you, Councillor Hyman. Any other councillors wish to comment?
I think the thing I would just comment briefly on this before we agree any of this money is that has in fact been before an inspector, and so we can, I think, have some assurance that it has been reviewed by the appropriate planning authority at that level to deem whether it required or not an appropriate assessment. And so I think in this particular case, were a plan to be passed that was unsound, the issue would probably be with the planning inspector that has approved it up to this point.
Councillors, any more? The recommendation is that the Executive approves a supplementary estimate of £51,000 to cover the costs of the Farnham Neighbourhood Plan Review. Is that agreed?
Agreed.
Thank you very much. We will go on to item 9, which is a property matter, the Borough's investment opportunity, and it is now in the overworked hands of Councillor Mark Merryweather.
Thank you again, Leader. Okay, so just to come back to a point that was made on one of the other interesting aspects of the consultation from residents is that they strongly support commercial initiatives by the council to generate revenue that will help pay for costs instead of raising taxes and fees and charges. So it's quite timely that we have this in front of us today. If you look at page 15, Annex A of the agenda papers, and just for the moment ignore the library and the recreation ground, there are 3 sites in this area, including the one we're sitting in the Berries, which may provide a commercial opportunity for this council. The building that we're actually in, even the newest parts are getting on for 50 years old. It is a building that has probably run its course. It is tremendously expensive to run. It costs between £600,000 and £700,000 a year to run, and it has a backlog of maintenance, and it has planned maintenance which will probably cost somewhere around about £2.5 million over the next 10 years. And even at that time, it will need significant capital works if that were an option that we wanted to do. And it's also underutilised. We do not use 25% of the space here, even with the tenants that we have. In the meantime, we have space available at the Wharf car park and possibly the Crown Court car park. And a few years ago, with external funding, an initial review was done as to whether we can improve on this by investing in some kind of a development. And the proposal here is that we follow up on the conclusions of that initial assessment and go into a more detailed appraisal and assessment of the options for these sites for us as a council to develop residential property and generate therefrom an income stream that we can use towards providing services for our residents. So that's the proposal. We estimate the costs will be about £40,000 for the completion of this options appraisal, and that's the recommendation to the Executive Leader.
Councillor Hyman, you are yet again down to speak on this item. Do you wish to speak?
Sorry, yes, Chairman, I did indicate to speak on all items simply because I didn't have time when I was calling this morning to check whether or not, specifically which items I wanted to speak, and I have had a chance to look through since. And in respect of this, it's simply a matter of that I want to check that executive members are fully aware of the reports that's already been, or interim report or whatever it is that's already been provided, and ask whether that's going to be provided or whether it is available to all members, because I'm looking at this blind. I've absolutely no idea whatsoever what the the background information to this is, so I can't be quite sure what we mean by having a new public service hub, or whether it's on-site or off-site. And I don't know exactly, to be honest, what each of the bits of land is and the ownership. I'm assuming the bit round behind the church is church gardens, and I assume that's owned by Surrey or Library Gardens because it's sort of next to the library. There's a bit by the quayside area as well. Is all of this involved, all of this land involved? We know about the move that Godalming Town Council have announced. I assume that the land there is also part of this. That's part of what's going on with this investment opportunity. But is there any possibility of giving us a little bit more information? Because we're completely in the blind, in the dark here, because we haven't been able to see the previous report. To the best of my knowledge, forgive me if I'm wrong. Obviously, please appreciate, Chairman, that. These committee papers came out on Monday, last Monday, and questions had to be in by the 24th of December, Christmas Eve. So, you know, obviously it was impossible for us to be able to address matters in advance. Normally the papers are out a few days before the deadline for questions from members. So we haven't had the opportunity on this occasion to be able to comment on these. And of course, with the holidays, also very limited time to be able to get through to speak to officers about each of these issues and go through the documents ourselves. So I apologise for that, but I don't think members we can be criticised for not having the documents before the deadline ran out for questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Hyman. Before I ask the portfolio holder to sum up, does any other councillor wish to speak?
I'm sure Mark will deal with the details. I just want to say I'm very pleased that this is obviously going to be staying in Godalming because it's fundamental to the town's successful operation of its high street for a start. Obviously the town council is moving out of the building, so I just want to say I hope that we'll continue to liaise with the town council. Obviously this is going to have a material impact on Godalming. Some of these sites, most of the sites here, I believe, are in Waverley's ownership, with exception of the sites around the library. But the bit I will just flag up particularly is obviously the car park in Crown Court is material to the operation of our community centre at the Wilfred Noyce, so it will be something that we'll be keeping a particular eye on. But thank you.
Councillor Merryweather, do you wish to sum up?
Yeah, I'm happy to do that, Leader, and respond. So, so in terms of Annex A, and I apologise if I didn't make it clear, I suggested everyone ignore the area around the library and the recreation ground for now. The area around the library, the two plots there, are owned by Surrey. The primary target of this will not be there. It will be the three sites owned by Waverley, the Crown Court car park, the Berries here, and the Wharf car park. Surrey is being included tangentially because we were asked if it could be, but this anything that comes from this proposal will not be dependent on that site being included. In terms of a prior report, there's no prior report. The prior administration commissioned a survey really focused on the redevelopment or other options, including status quo, as is, for this site. It's the status quo option outcome from that report that I referred to when I talked about the current running costs and the backlog, the inefficiencies and the underutilisation. It was some of the other possible options that were identified in that report that we want to follow up on now, the only difference being that the prior report, or sort of the prior very high level appraisal, really focused on the redevelopment of the council offices and using other council assets to sell to fund that particular project. And the approach now is, I suggest the polar opposite. The proposal now is to undertake an investment project that will benefit the entire borough community by generating revenue, by generating housing, by generating a development potentially that meets the standards that we would like to set and we would like other developers to follow in terms of quality of build. And at the same time, delivering as part of that a council office and also replacement offices for all of our other partners who stay here with us, and replacing all of the car parking that will be used, no loss in car parking, so that we end up with a development which we can all be proud of, which generates revenue we desperately need, and which is good for Godalming as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Any other member of the executive wish to speak? In that case, the recommendation is that the executive approve the use of up to £40,000 for the completion of the options appraisal. Is that agreed?
Agreed.
Thank you very much, councillors. We now move to item 10, Housing Responsive Repairs and Voids Contract, which is in the hands of Councillor Rosoman.
Thank you, Leader. As members will recall from a meeting, all the way before Christmas, in early December, we became aware that MPS had served notice to terminate the contract early, so they will not be our contractor anymore from March. And obviously we need to be in a position where we can respond to repairs and voids contracts following that early termination. I hope you've all had a chance to read the report as well as the exempt papers, and that I don't need to go through all the details. The proposal before us is to appoint an interim alternative contractor and commence procurement for a longer term contract. The Executive is therefore asked to agree delegated authority to the Head of Housing Operations, Hugh Wagstaff, to progress the actions necessary to cut out the procurement exercises. I won't move to the recommendation in case anyone wants to ask questions. Okay.
Thank you very much. Yet again, I have Councillor Hyman to speak.
No, didn't intend to speak on this, Chairman. Thanks. No need to go into exempt.
Thank you very much. To save your voice, shall I move the recommendation for you? The recommendation is long and torturous. It is recommended that the Executive... I am reading the right one, am I? Yes, I am. That the Executive authorises the Council's Section 151 officer to waive the Council's contract procurement rules in accordance with paragraphs 9.3.1 and 9.3.3 of the CPRs in order for the Council to appoint an interim responsive repairs and voids contractor. Secondly, it delegates authority to the Head of Housing Operations in consultation with the portfolio holder for housing for the Strategic Director, i.e. the S151 officer, to A. Appoint consultants to provide advice and undertake such work as is required to achieve an interim contract within agreed budgets and in accordance with the Council's contract procedure rules. B. Select and adopt an interim contractor for 12-24 months within agreed budgets and in accordance with the Council's contract procedure rules. C. Appoint consultants to assist with procurement for the permanent contractor within agreed budgets and in accordance with the Council's contract procedure rules. And D. Draw down up to £200,000 from the Housing Revenue Account Contingency Reserve to achieve these recommendations. And item 3 notes that officers will report performance and procurement progress to the Housing Overview and Scrutiny Committee and the Executive. Is that agreed? Thank you very much. We will now move to item 11, which is reverting to Councillor Merryweather.
Thank you again, Leader. The item here is a way of dealing with some risk. We don't have a policy on consent for the use of common land and council-owned land and property, and we may be one of the few to actually start doing so. We did some research in coming to this draft and couldn't find any examples that we could use. But it is a very simple and straightforward policy. If we are approached by a third party who wants to use our land, the policy simply says that we will follow a due process and let them, with or without conditions, or refuse that request. It's in many respects stating the obvious, but it's codifying the obvious, and I recommend that we approve it. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Hyman, you are down to speak on this item as well.
Thank you. This was the reason that I indicated, actually, Chairman, and I have spoken to officers a couple of times in relation to this matter, and You start from the top, you get the version control sorted because it says at the bottom of each page that this is version 1 and it's supposedly version 0.1 elsewhere and all the rest of it. It's very good that we've got some note of version control, but with, as the same as with the tax strategy, which is the next item, the version control still isn't being done properly. The numbers are all right. If we're going to do it, let's do it properly. This is a policy for use of common land and council-owned land. And then when you go through the headings, you've got common land, unregistered land. Now, of course, you know, this is a very complicated issue, and I have done Section 38 inquiry myself, hearing myself in the past, representing an organisation, and so I know a little bit about it. I don't know whether this is talking about Section 45 land or whether it's vested land or whether it's highway waste or whether it's manorial waste. We've got a difficulty, I appreciate, with the UK oil and gas situation. I know from what officers have said this also helps us to address issues like telecommunication masts, but we've supposedly got a hole in our protection. Yet this says it's about common land, and that's registered common land, presumably mainly, because most is. Yet, strangely, there is nothing in here, there's no heading in here saying what our policy is in respect of registered common land. And when you read down, well, it might be that it's telling us what it is. It quotes what the government's guidance is and says that we're going to be following it. It doesn't say we're going to abide by it. I think we really ought to be saying what we're going to be doing. It then quotes the highlights of it and doesn't really explain to us whether we're going to be following the whole of the government guidance and the law, or whether we're going to be just paying attention to the bits which have been extracted. So it's not a policy. I know all members have received an email, I've been told earlier by Councillor Macleod, who phoned me, that all members of, executive members have received an email, which I haven't seen myself, from, I think, Open Spaces Society, explaining that they have got very, very severe concerns in relation to this policy. So I'd like to know whether you are going to pay attention to what they said, whatever it has said, because they're the experts and we're not. We're putting forward a policy here which we haven't consulted upon. It's being granted consent by the executive without any scrutiny or any possibility of scrutiny. I think you're putting us in a terrible position because, you know, I'm in a position where by rights I should be asking the Conservative group to call this in. I shouldn't be put in that position ever, really. This should have been put in front of us long ago, so we had an opportunity to go through it and understand it, and it is fairly complicated. We need legal advice on this before this is put through, absolutely certainly. I mean, if you look at the very last bit of it, it says here, this policy applies to land and property assets. For land council as an owner, we own a lot of land, car parks, council houses, car parks, all sorts all over the place. It then says anyone wishing to have access over a council asset will have to apply for a consent, and then we have to, well, obviously we can't have blank statement, you know, blanket statements like that in a document. That's it's just rubbish. So this needs to be gone through properly. Someone should have read it before it came forwards. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Councillor Hyman. I can confirm that I have not received anything from the Open Spaces Society. I can also confirm in my 13 years as a councillor I've never heard of them. However, I believe my deputy wishes to speak.
So I'm sure Councillor Macleod and Councillor Merryweather will add some more to this, but I did just want to propose that we give some delegated powers to the head of this particular service so that we can address some of the drafting issues, because there are some drafting issues in it. I don't generally think that this would forbid all access to all types of council land under all circumstances, which I think was the issue that Councillor Hyman was particularly concerned about. So, for example, as a third party, would you need to apply to have access to access the berries, for example, which would be council land? I don't think it's going to that degree, but I do think we need to add some definitions to the top regarding common land and unregistered land, which is something that I also propose that is included in that delegation. Otherwise, I shall probably hand over to Councillor Macleod, I think.
Councillor Macleod.
Thank you, Leader. Just to make it clear, that I called Councillor Hyman today because he had expressed some concerns to me about this issue after the members' briefing last night, and I thought I would find out what his concerns were in order to make Councillor Merryweather aware of them. as he would have to answer them. In terms of the email that Councillor Hyman referred to, it was actually him who told me rather than me who told him. I just want to make that clear. He told me about this open spaces email rather than me telling him.
Any other member of the executive wish to speak? Can I just clarify then, Councillor Follows, are you proposing an amendment to the recommendation such that it's going to say something like, it is recommended that we approve the land lease consent policy, but to delegate to the portfolio holder in conjunction with the head of service to tidy up the wording?
Yes, including definitions of some of those land terms, just so that it's very clear what we are talking about.
Could I have a seconder for that? Thank you, Councillor Beeman. Members of the executive, are you content with that recommendation as amended?
Agreed.
Thank you very much. Item 12 is, I'm delighted to say, cough sweets afterwards in the hands of Councillor Merryweather.
Thank you again, Leader. So the council does have a tax strategy. It is something which is brought forward. It's not a new strategy, and effectively it's required to have it. We're required to have it to fill our responsibilities under the Criminal Finances Act, and it's really a criminally related policy rather than anything else. So in terms of where it is there are a couple of changes there from the, I believe, the prior draft, which are that there's a spelling change in 4.1, and there's a more structured monitoring and review section. So this will not be reviewed periodically. It will actually be reviewed annually by the officers and then submitted to the Audit Committee and the Executive, certainly every 2 years, and more frequently when a significant change in policy is proposed, if that is sooner. So the recommendation is that we approve that revised tax strategy. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Hyman. You're down to speak on this item again.
Yes, this was my other concern, Chairman. Very interesting tax strategy we've got here. Paragraph 7.4 says that we've, as councillors, have been trained. So in ensuring that there's no that we can avoid the risk of tax evasion by people who the council deals with. If I can refer you, please, to paragraph page 34, 4.2 of the officer report. Sorry, I'm working on my machine here. It's a bit awkward making my way through it. 4.2, it explains the guidance issued by HMRC, focuses on the failure to prevent crimes with regard to tax for those who act for or on behalf of the council. So we're talking about contractors and everybody that we deal with. It says it should be easy to hold to account and attribute criminal liability to the relevant body for the act of employees, agents, or those that provide services for us. So the whole point is that the government is expecting us to take on responsibilities which are, you know, really people might think are not strictly our responsibilities. It's, you know, in the private sector, other people who we deal with, we have to have policies in place to try and do our very best to ensure that there's that they cannot evade taxes that are anything to do with their dealings with us. So that's what we have to do. We must go further, according to HMRC, and that's what this policy is for. The strategy is for. We must go further than one would expect to. So that's what the officer report explains. And if we go to paragraph 3.2 of the strategy itself, it says. The last few words of this says that Waverley does not regard itself as responsible for actively assessing the tax compliance of other bodies or individuals. Of course, in a way that's true, I think, because Waverley isn't legally legally responsible for assessing their tax compliance. But that's not what this is meant to be about. This is actually about us making sure, it's not about us assessing them. It's about us making sure that the way that we operate is not going to allow others. So I think Waverley in this scheme misses the point completely, because we, in this document, are saying the opposite to what the officer report says this document is about. So that's a very worrying thing to me that nobody seems to have read this document. You look at the version control on this, it says it's version control at the beginning, version 2, then you go to the second page and version 2 doesn't exist, which is exciting. So can we sort these things out? There are a number of issues. Somebody should have read this first. If you look, I think it's at paragraph, what did I see, the paragraph 8.1, yeah, has got typos. 5.3, I don't know why we're leaving 5.3 as a number for some reason. There are lots of bits and pieces that show this really should be read before it goes any further forward. But I am concerned, Chairman. Please add something so that we can just sort out typos and whatever. But please also make sure that somebody looks at whether we're approaching this correctly, because our policy says the opposite to what the HMRC's intention is for this tax strategy, and that's a concern. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you. Before I ask the portfolio holder to reply, does any other member of the executive wish to speak? Councillor Merryweather.
Thank you, Leader. I've got a printed out version which doesn't seem to have the same issues as the version that is up on the web. Well, 5.3 has been deleted, so that number.
There's a number.
That number comes out when you approve the change. That number falls off automatically. A red line document like this won't delete the paragraph number. But to avoid, so that's it on the typos, and I'm happy if someone wants to propose that we have delegated authority to make sure that the tracked changes go through as they are supposed to do. I'm happy to do it. But also just in terms of the consistency with HMRC. The HMRC, I think, is quite clear that we're really covered by people who are acting on our behalf, and not contractors that we or suppliers that we simply use. If we pop into WH Smith to buy an envelope and spend money there, we are not responsible through Nexus for WH Smith's tax liabilities. That's not what the government says, and that is not what this particular document says. So apart from the typos or the potential typos, which may be lying there once we approve the red line, I am happy to continue with the recommendation.
Any other member of the executive wish to speak? Okay, thank you, Councillor Merryweather. I think it is well known and understood that typos can be corrected afterwards. I see no need for anything other than putting the recommendation to the group that it is recommended that the attached tax revision strategy for 2020 to 22 be approved, and I am sure when the track changes, which were there for everybody's information, are accepted, that it will look in a more pristine form as the portfolio holder has, and that any weird typos will be removed at the end. Is that agreed, councillors?
Agreed.
Agreed. Thank you very much. I see no reason to go into exempt. That is the end of the meeting.